It is May 28th, 2017. You're listening to the Fancy Ramen podcast. I'm Neil Young. Today, I'm joined with Scott Trickle.
We're going remote today.
Exactly. Scott's calling in from across town, and Cookie may or may not be joining us at some point. He's currently in Chicago.
Hi, guys.
Hey, there he is.
Hey.
Before we get into the topics today, we did not have enough time to cover 2 emails last week, and we actually got hit with a third one of which from one of our senders, Dave. So let's go ahead and start with that. This first one is the combination of both emails from Dave. I would like to echo a lot of the negative sentiment about Another. On past episodes, Scott has talked to length about playing Fire Emblem games, so I'm surprised your crew haven't talked about the most recent released title, Fire Emblem Echoes. Are there any strong opinions about it? I was shocked to hear you guys watch the entirety of Death Parade last week. On that note, I wanted to talk about format as well, since that's apparently on the table. You've talked about making a separate show just talking about anime. While I personally don't mind your marathon-length episodes, if you're concerned about making episodes more manageable, doing one for your fancy animes might prove to be beneficial. As for Death Parade, you guys skipped the discussion. You skipped the discussion over Chiyuki's final judgment. I personally found it to be a suitable ending to the series. Yours truly, Dave.
So I've totally looked into Fire Emblem Echoes, and I kind of looked into it on behalf of Dave's email, because after playing the last Fire Emblem, I felt maybe a little burned out. I really, really enjoyed Conquest, but then I borrowed Birthright from my sister. We bought them and each got our own game and then swapped them after being done. And I don't know, maybe it was just after Birthright, I felt really burned out for a bit. And so I was thinking maybe I'd take a break on the next Fire Emblem game, but looking into some more of the details on what they've done for Echoes Shadow of Valencia, I think I might actually pick this up later. They've made some adjustments that seem really cool. They've readjusted archers to have like a much longer range, and they're also able to attack adjacent now, which is nice because it does seem reasonable that you could still fire a bow even if you're in melee combat range in an actual historical combat sense. And then you also have, let's see, you also have the ability to use weapons without worrying about degradation, which is another really big thing that you used to have to manage in the old games. It was just, I found it to be honestly kind of annoying at the end of the day more than anything else. It kept you from abusing weapons that had a really high critical hit, or like killing lances, or armor slayers, which were swords that could do lots of damage to knights because they had essentially a damage boost against that particular unit type. So I don't know how they've balanced this in the game yet, but that seems like a really cool adjustment, that you can kind of specialize units a little more. And then the biggest thing that has got me excited about this game, now that I've looked into it a little bit more, is that they actually don't have the weapon triangle in this. And so, do you know what the weapon triangle normally does, Neil?
Yeah, sword beats axe, axe beats spear, spear beats sword.
You got it. And then depending on the game, there was normally a weapons triangle for magic as well. But it looks like in this game, swords don't intrinsically have an advantage against axes. So all of your combat is going to be based upon your character's stats instead, which is going to make it, I think, harder to get some units wins against opponents that are going to be, at or above their level. Because that was one thing that you could always do, is if you're training a weaker axe unit, just make sure the only people he can ever fight in combat are lances, and he at least has the edge. But it looks like you'll have to take a different approach to that. And I like that idea. That should really mix things up. Having archers being more effective as tactical units and taking out the weapons triangle means that these combat situations aren't going to play out in the same way that they would in any other Fire Emblem game. Item abilities are also tied to those actual items. So you'll be able to learn a new skill from an item, but if you transition to using a different item, or you equip something else, you actually lose that skill. So now your like equipment loadout is going to be more important, and that's probably a good reason as to why they took out the weapon durability function. Is because now that your skill is tied to an item and your loadout is going to have an effect on how your character plays, you don't want to have that particular item or skill break or disappear within the middle of a fight. So these are all features that have me really excited, and thanks to Dave's email, I decided to actually look into Echoes to see maybe if I do pick this up, as opposed to just wait for a new title to come out with something that piqued my interest.
I'm really curious because this seems like the least Fire Emblem-y game to date, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing either.
Yeah, I'd agree. I don't think it's a bad thing right now. Like, Fire Emblem has had so many good games and iterations that if they like mix up the style and they really try something new here, I'm totally willing to give them benefit of the doubt. And I'm actually more likely to purchase the game if they do decide to spice things up, because with the beauty of emulators, and I still like to keep a lot of my like classic consoles. If I ever do want to play like a really good Fire Emblem game, there isn't much that's stopping me from going back and playing the classic Game Boy Advance title like Sacred Stones again, because those games are so much fun, and you can always play them and follow a different path and upgrade different characters. Like, there's just so much content jam-packed in them. You can play them over and over again. If I want the same thing, I can just hash it out on an old game that they've already played it. But if they make something new, it's a great way to motivate me as a buyer and a fan of the series to like really try it out, and it piques my interest quite a bit.
The durability change in particular, the durability factor within older Fire Emblem games, I've always felt was more a nuisance and not really beneficial to the game as a whole. At least right now I'm thinking about the games where you could repair your items using money and it was no difficulty in doing that. I can't remember if that's a staple in the series.
It's not a staple necessarily. A lot of those games, what would end up happening is you'd just be pragmatic and buy a duplicate of the same item if you could. But for someone like, I'm the type of gamer who can be described by how I play games that have a finite resource. In Resident Evil 4, like I never ever used a green herb until I was able to make it into like what you can combine them together to get the full healing spray. But even then, I never used the full healing spray after I got it. Like, I really hoard high quality items and always try to do the best with like the bare bones stuff that I have. Same way in Fallout, any good weapons I'd like stash away so they wouldn't degrade and I'd use something else. Fire Emblem was the same thing. You could get a really awesome staff or a really awesome sword, but if it only had like 20 uses, I put it into my caravan and never took it out again. Like, I'd fight the whole games with iron swords. So now that they're taking out durability, I don't have to get over my like hoarder sensibilities to get to enjoy a lot of like diverse items and weapon sets.
So, not trying to get super off topic, but Neil, does that make you worried for Scott when he plays Cookie's Breath of the Wild?
So I've played just a small bit of it, and I saw how quickly things burn through on their durability. And I can, because I also know that you don't get like any items that are absolutely unique as far as I can tell. I'm not too worried about that. It's when I have something unique that can break down that I really kind of freak out. And I'm like, well, I don't ever want to use it so it doesn't break, so it's always available for when I need it.
Before Death Parade, talking about like the format, if we want to do, I know we've talked about doing fancy roll before. I don't know if we did that on camera or not.
Yeah, we've done it on mic at least once, if not twice.
That might end up being a thing. I think it just depends on how often we end up doing like anime watch alongs and whatnot. But yeah. I've definitely become more receptive about that being something we should potentially pursue. Death Parade, Chiyuki's Judgments. That is, I believe, the very last episode. You're right. I think we kind of just skipped over that since we were pressed on time. I don't know if I have much to say. Like, that's the defining moment for when Decim or Decim shows off the full human emotions and human perspective. But Scott, were you surprised when it turned out not to be an actual choice? Like she was not going to be revived, that it turned out to be like a trial?
I was surprised, but it was such a fitting ending. Like it was a really satisfying little twist at the end there. I first off like to be surprised by the conclusion of good media. I especially like it when I can't predict the outcome or the ending. And so I think most things get a little bit of a boost in my opinion if I do feel like, oh, they took me for a loop here, or they threw me for a loop. Like I had no idea it would turn out this way. But I thought it was really I don't know, it was quite satisfying. But I thought that she did get reincarnated.
She did, yeah. That final scene, or that whole final trial for her, I kind of had a weird theory going into it because I know through some discussion...
You're talking about her trial to hit the button to replace somebody, right?
Exactly. I'm assuming that's what Dave meant here too, right?
Yeah. I assume so.
When Decim talks about going to the very bottom, this kind of reflects off of some online discussion I had read over people talking about what way the light goes when people are reincarnated or when they're sent to the void. And people seem to indicate that there was a potential that elevators would go down during reincarnation too. Before we saw what the bottom actually was, and when we were under the possible illusion that that was reality and, we were somehow... or that was Earth that they were on, I had the thought that maybe they were on some sort of Tower of Babel. Like, it isn't the whole theory there that, they built the Tower of Babel to get closer to the gods? Or theories,
right?
Legends.
But they couldn't. Yeah, they couldn't approach it after they were all condemned to speak different languages.
So
unable to communicate. So other people thought to look for seeing if the light shifted up or down, but did anybody actually come to a conclusion on what it looked like? Because I was trying to look to see where the light progressed to between the cracks in the elevator doorway as well, but I was never able to tell very easily if it went up or down.
That was kind of the whole discussion over, people were arguing that the masks were not indicative of where they went. Although it's totally indicative. I don't know how people got that assumption. That being said, though, getting that triggered into my mind, I kind of thought that maybe the ground floor, as Decim put it, actually meant Earth. So I was also kind of caught off guard when it turned out to all be a hoax or a, what's the word I'm looking for? A trial.
I don't know. I didn't really think that it ever could be Earth because it seemed like it was... Maybe it was just with the positioning of everything else that it seemed like an otherworldly place. Like when, Ginty has his game of Twister, for instance, that pit just opens up. And I understand that these areas are supposed to kind of defy the laws of reality, but that was also part of my assumption as to why it couldn't be Earth. Is this building defies the laws of reality, and therefore it can't exist in any sort of physical space in conjunction with the Earth. Yeah,
that's a good point.
Yeah, I always thought it was a spiritual realm for how the rest of the setting was so surreal and illogical in its setup.
I do have a question. So you were talking earlier about there being the idea that the masks weren't actually indicative of where people were going.
Yeah, some people online were trying to argue that the masks were potentially not the symbol of whether people would end up going to the void or to reincarnation. And I think some of those posts were made in the middle of the airing, so back in 2015. But personally, I felt like the masks were clearly the sign of where they would go, and it seemed to be supported by Decim telling or affirming those things to Chiyuki in the first couple episodes, episode 2, I think, specifically.
Oh, okay, because Lizzie still wants us to go back and reconvene because she doesn't believe that she was wrong in her notes that she took about where the girl who did the plastic surgery then.
No, she totally goes to reincarnation, because otherwise there's no reason for her to go into the void. Yeah, I can certainly double check, but I am like 110% sure they both went to the happy place, because based on that was the episode I remember thinking to myself, like, okay, so it can all be good.
Yeah, I think I confirmed using Wikipedia too. Like if you looked up Wikipedia, they had a summary of each outcome at the end of the episodes on the episode summaries.
Wikipedia-kun always pulling out for us too.
Rolling Ballad, the last thing that the Wikipedia said was like they're both sent to be reincarnated.
Oh, okay, I can dig it. Anyway, on to the rest of the email.
All right.
So our next email is unsigned, and it is not from our emailer from last week either, just an FYI. Hello, Fancy Ramen. I stumbled on your podcast watching your playthrough of Little Nightmares. I also noticed your playthrough of Life is Strange has gone without updates for a while. Is this still going on?
Is it?
I don't know, Neil. Is it?
Yeah, I don't really know. I kind of feel like it would be fine to not continue it. We'll say it's on hiatus right now.
I'm fine with that.
I think
it's not our moneymaker as far as our content goes.
Well, let's be honest here. Nothing's our moneymaker.
And then cries a little.
I think the big thing is that we need to be enjoying the game or enjoy recording and playing the game with each other to want to continue it.
Are you saying that Life is Strange isn't enjoyable?
I don't think it's as enjoyable like as a shared experience, if that makes sense. Like there's a lot of running around and not really saying much, you know?
Yeah, I can understand that. It was definitely a game that I played like by myself for the most part, where I would just explore around and aimlessly interact with every object before moving the story forward. And so while that's enjoyable, it's really not worth like watching, and there's really hard time to, I imagine, fill with commentary about things.
Wow, that trash can looks hyper realistic within a cell shaded sense. And that old man, you know, I really wonder what led him to be senile and without a job or home.
After I sweep, I paint.
All right, that's it for emails. Let's talk about some of the things that have happened over the last week. Let's talk about something that is topical to where your life is going, Scott.
It's exceptionally topical. So I got really excited when I found out about this on Twitter. I was like sitting at work. I think it was during my lunch period, and I just checked out Twitter really quick, and I saw Far Cry 5 announces its new locale. And I mean, I get excited for it either way, because although I haven't played probably more than 10 minutes of any Far Cry game, I do get very excited about like where they choose to go. They've had an island, they've had an African savanna, they've done another island. I mean, you'd expect them for let's see, what did they do for the last one? For Far Cry 4 is like India or Nepal, wasn't it Nepal?
Or rather a fictitious setting of Nepal.
They're all like really cool locations. They're types of places that you really don't encounter in other games very much. The only other game I can think of that did like a really cool locale that's very immersive was the very first Crysis, especially if you played it on its hardest mode where everybody's speaking in Korean, and so you can't simply play the game and figure out what the guards are up to because they just happen to be speaking English, in this foreign country. So Far Cry 5, everybody would expect that, following logical reasoning, that it would be something really exciting again. And, where's it going to be this time?
Is it space?
It's not space. It's fictional Hope County in Montana. That was quite a surprise, I think, for a lot of people, including myself. But it could be still a really exotic, with, air quotes, type of locale. And I, of course, am super biased as that being my home state. But Montana is a really cool place where its geography coalesces between kind of Great Plains and mountain ranges, and you'll have a lot of, like rivers and lakes all coming together in what should make for a very exciting environment to traverse. And with all the Doomsday preppers out there, it's really not too hard to imagine having firefights out in those areas. Also, the other thing to note about it is that the faction seems to be pretty interesting this time around, too. The factions for the older Far Cry games, do you know much about them, Neil? Because I only know Far Cry 2. The faction were African soldiers loyal to, I think, this guy called the Jackal. And I'm not even sure if that's entirely correct, because, like I said, I haven't played very much of it. But this is definitely going to be kind of like a hot button issue for America right now, because it's the antagonist faction of religious zealots in a place that's known for being very I don't know, it's still very Wild West out in Montana, even in 2017 in some areas that are underpopulated. It wouldn't be too hard to imagine that religious zealots were able to claim some land and set up arms. It would be hard to imagine that the U.S. military and other like domestic peacekeeping services wouldn't be able to take them down, but I imagine that they'll be able to find a way to make it seem reasonable in the like setting and story.
Wait, I have a question. Didn't that happen last summer?
Yeah, it happened out in Oregon. That's another thing too. I think that was actually a like inspiration for them. They didn't want this to be associated whatsoever with any sort of like fascist alt-right Donald Trump presidency style of relationship, but they did note that the Oregon incident in which that like wildlife area was taken over by a bunch of I guess armed American citizens was like a big inspiration to that.
Did they go on the record saying that they did not want to talk about or make this about the like sort of alt-right movement that has become a topic over the last year or last 6 months?
They've like explicitly stated that it's not to be compared to that. Although, it's just kind of unfortunate circumstance that happens to be a very like comparable and like topical relationship.
Maybe I'm not going to be fair in saying this because this game has probably been in development since you could say maybe 2014, conceptually maybe as early as 2013.
Yeah, I'd say so.
But I really wish it was about that. I wish, and granted, again, it's not fair because this is something that has spurred up more over the last 6 to 7 months. But this is like, I keep hearing about people saying this is really controversial. This is really controversial. People are up in arms, blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's like a big point or it's anything technically that controversial. Like religious zealots when armed are a bad thing. Yes, like I think we can all agree.
I think we all can agree. And it looks like they're also going to be mitigating this somewhat, that it's not like the only characters that happen to be like religious or displayed as people of faith are the bad guys. They, in the trailer, show like a more what you would expect at least to be a mainstream or like rational priest, and he's shown as an ally in the game, and so they'll have representation not only of this antagonist faction as being, as using religion as a tool in order to like achieve their goals and enact the atrocities that they most likely will as villains, but they also already have a counterpoint of, a reasonable person of faith who's going to be a good guy or taking up arms against them. And so I would say that people who are looking for controversy in this are doing exactly that. Like, they're not considering all of the context that's already being loaded into this game before we even play it.
Absolutely. The religion is also as far as I know, a fake one. Like the symbols that they're also using
are fake, yeah.
like at the very most, it might be related to like an old Celtic image. It's not a cross, and it's not to be mistaken for a cross either, for that matter. At the one point when you see the gluttony murder, there is like the circular cross or plus, I will say, instead of cross image, impaled into a man. But they even go to the length of making the shaft that's actually inside of the body being a completely different shape or width than like the symbol itself, to distinguish the difference between the two.
And I don't think that Christians are going to lose their shit over this either. Like I think most people are reasonable people, and so it goes without saying that then people of faith, you can expect most of them to also be reasonable people. The ones who will complain and find a controversial point and say that this is, propaganda or this is like poisoning perception of a particular religion or religious group is I think taking things a step too far. And I imagine that the Far Cry development team from the get-go and their writers were aware that this could be super touchy ground, especially in the United States, where at least for now, our populace is a majority of Christians. Like, they're not going to go so far as to offend what is probably one of their large player bases.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think it should be pretty easy to trust them to respect this, because if they were to be so foolhardy as to not, then it would absolutely sink them as a studio, I think.
I don't necessarily know at this point if it's the media pushing that there is some sort of political message in this, or that it's the studio doing that to some degree. Because if it's the latter, I feel like they're missing an opportunity to actually send home a deeper, better message. But it's also unfair to expect that.
Right. It's unfair to expect a video game made for entertainment to make a like really profound and like effective statement in anything, really. Like, at the end of the day, these are made for entertainment, and they're made to tell stories. And in the history of the world, telling stories just happens to be correlated with making critiques and thoughtful insights and like spurring thought and idea, but it's not necessarily the primary focus for something like this. Like, games that do a really good job of pushing the envelope and really like asserting some sort of idea that their players have to grapple with are wonderful. Like Spec Ops: The Line, that's a game that will continue to get praise for how it approached its idea and how it tried to make people maybe think differently about such a I guess video game trope that existed beforehand. To we need to just suppress these people because they're bad guys and we got to deal with them. Like, kudos to video games that do a really good job of telling a story and having some sort of, like, I'd say, deeper philosophical impact. But at the end of the day, I think it's a lot to expect that as a product of as a product of what your like AAA video game title should always do.
There is one thing I wanted to point out, though. As I was watching the full release trailer and everything that they have since shown, I might have missed it, but I don't think there are any religious zealots that follow this, like, Gate to Eden or whatever the religion is called, that are of color. I don't think there's. I think everyone is white, if I'm not mistaken.
So, as someone who is very white, and I come from Montana, which is probably, it can probably fairly be named the Great White North. Like, that state is almost 90% white. My hometown is maybe one of the most diverse places in Montana, and it's still so almost ubiquitously white. And so that's one of the things that I think is also going to be, it's being fair to the locale, but it is disappointing because diversity is always a nice thing to see in any sort of form of media these days. Like, I like seeing representation of a lot of different people, but it is fair to say that if you're going to find like any sort of diversity, you're not going to find it in Montana, especially not in probably where this like the fictional space that Hope County occupies is definitely not a place you're going to find too many people of like different backgrounds or color.
Out in the country, probably not like in the more populated areas from the looks of it. But the pastor, or priest, I should say, that is not the religious zealot priest.
And he's a black guy too, who's the good guy. So he's both the representation of a more diverse cast and of the like good spin on this like religious on religion in general, but also on like the Christianic or Abrahamic religions, which these zealots are obviously a part of something that's like monotheism. I think it's hard not to see the similarity between their symbolism,
right,
and what like real religious zealot groups would have.
My point being, though, that I think if there is going to be an actual politically meaningful message in this game, aside from the things we all know, blah blah blah, I would really hope that there's something anti-white supremacy in this game.
Yeah. I would really like to see something like that. No idea if that's what it's going to be, but those areas are known for having like at least a history with white supremacy. Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which is like this absolutely gorgeous town in the upper panhandle of Idaho, I think had like some sort of old relation with like old like Nazi occupation or something. I'm trying to think because Idaho and some other places like that, like when we used to have prisoners of war, we had a lot of Nazis stored in those areas. And so after the war, some Nazis went back to Germany, but others, put down roots and stayed in the United States, I think.
Oh, really?
So,
I didn't realize.
Yeah. There's totally background and history about that.
They were actually all super happy.
Yeah. They were treated really well. That's also the other thing, is the Americans treated them very well as war prisoners for the most part.
The local farmers were actually really sad to see them leave because they would actually go out and build them.
Cookie's getting digitized.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay, dude. But yeah, they used to be, labor out in those areas while they were prisoners of war, and then afterward, they had the ability to become, part of that like civic fabric, essentially. And so that like stain still kind of remains to this day.
I mean, it's not like they have to have a message like that, but I would hope for it now within our current political and racial climate, we'll say. I hope that like an opportunity like this does not pass us up without some positive messaging or imaging going across.
Yeah, that would be really cool to see. And I think maybe you might be feeling a little spoiled to this because Persona 5, didn't you say also, like, just happened to be so perfectly crafted for the times? Like, it just happened to be this really great contemporary and relevant story, is what you were saying earlier when you were first playing the game, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I can't help but want to play it more and more after reading about the horrible situations we are getting ourselves, we as Americans are finding ourselves in politically.
Yeah.
Not to go into our politics or our personal politics too much, but that's the feeling I have bringing myself into entertainment and wanting some escapism. When I'm given a game that gives me some relevance to my personal beliefs, I feel more fulfilled, I guess.
I can totally understand that, and I think that's a really cool thing. Hopefully, it becomes a more common event in the future. But I also think that sometimes it can just end up that like Persona 5 just happened to hit like things right on the mark, and that takes a considerable amount of foresight and like thought, but also a lot of luck on whether it is really relevant and intelligent commentary.
Especially when you consider the amount of years that need to go into game development.
That's right. you're trying to guess like 5 years ahead of time, which I mean some prolific like science fiction authors have done, and other literary figures have been able to do that. But when you're producing something, it's also supposed to be entertaining and interactive. That I think that makes it even more difficult. And so I also want to note, since Cookie's like going back and forth from being able to just barely get into the chat to almost no connection at all, he did pitch two things that he wanted to note. He said, first off, that there should be a counterpoint for people not getting offended about games. He said the guys who made Smite, they had to change a bunch of characters due to religious iconography, and they did a bunch of research like to be as respectful as they could, but they still got stuck with having to change things. It's one of those things too where you can do your absolute best to avoid controversy and issue, and you still get it. It's the same issue that Resident Evil 5 had when they had Africa as one of as essentially the continent of interest. I don't know where it took place in Africa because I didn't play the game very much, but people were super mad because, well, you're two white people who are just going around killing a lot of black people. Doesn't that seem a little suspect?
Correction, I think the second player was black. A black
was
woman.
She? Okay. I just know that the first player was your usual muscled white guy protagonist. But the thing that I think we also spoke about with that is nobody was like crying foul when we were killing a bunch of like rural Spaniards in Resident Evil 4 and stuff like that. It's sometimes people are sensitive to it and other times they're not, and it really just depends on kind of the optics and all the other context around it.
Let's talk about E3, which is going to be June 13th to June 15th, with conferences starting as early as June 10th. The hype train is accelerating, especially for the Scorpio as E3 approaches. Xbox boss Phil Spencer has gone as far as to say, "I'm very confident from what we are seeing and hearing. Scorpio will be the very best console version of games this year."
Is there any way that we can start calling Phil Spencer the X-Boss now that you've gone there?
Yeah, maybe, I guess. That has a nice ring to it, right? Although when he gets fired, we'll feel really bad. Because he'll
then
become
you just put an E in front of it.
Much easier to
It's really
fix.
modifiable.
Now, when the PS4 Pro released, Sony faced backlash for games performing below expectation with the Pro settings. I'd go as far as to say it took months before issues were resolved as a whole. Microsoft is expecting to announce the launch date for the Scorpio at E3, and maybe what it's actually going to be called, assuming the Scorpio is still a project name. While the common assumption is that we'll be seeing a holiday release, what's the likelihood that we'll actually see a strong release for this hardware when essentially the consumers are going to end up being, if you will, they're beta testers, just like any other developer in game console at this point?
I also think that we should ask the question, if they do end up renaming the Xbox Scorpio to something else, what's your chances, Neil, on it being another number of some sort? Like, do we finally get our Xbox 720, 1080, or 4K? Like, or do we end up with a different name for it? Because I kind of both love and hate that Microsoft has such a weird naming scheme for everything. They don't follow the usual convention that you'd expect set by the PlayStation precedent of 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they don't necessarily have the same level of like whimsy and like functional reference as Nintendo does with their devices.
So Cookie says he's going with Xbox HD. I feel like that might be a misnomer because HD would equate to being 1080p.
I agree that it's a misnomer, and they probably won't use it because it would be bad PR.
But at the same time, Xbox is not very good at naming to begin with because their 360 ran at 720p. Which,
yeah, and Xbox One, it's a backpedal for a lot of people, I think, if it's just going to be another... Like, if it were the be-all, end-all of consoles, the Xbox One would be a really cool name, I think. But since everybody knows in another 5 to 10 years you'll make a new console, it's just a really weird place to have any sort of like name for a console that will eventually be a midpoint.
I'm under the impression, and this might not be a popular opinion, because I know the idea is they want the Scorpio to be somewhat synonymous with the Xbox One. They don't want people to think that you can't play one. Like it's not going to be a completely new console, as they put it. But the way they're building this, from like a marketing standpoint, I feel like the most suitable name they could do is just go Xbox 2.
I don't think it'll happen. I'm totally willing to bet against that, but it's not a bad idea. I think the only argument I'd have for the Xbox 2 part is that they already did Xbox 360, Xbox One. Like by pushing it to the Xbox 2, maybe Xbox 2.0 I could see. 2.0 would make more sense.
But then if you do 2.0, does that mean you have to actually put the number 2 period O? I was thinking they would actually do TWO.
I don't know about that. Who knows? But no matter whatever they name it, that's not going to matter nearly as much as actually, how it performs and how it sells. You're talking about the PS4 Pro, which we can go ahead and note that the Pro is a great way to name it by keeping PS4 in the title and just adding that very small, essentially like addendum of the Pro. They're able to designate that it's within the same library of games, but just a higher quality. But I wanted to approach that you noted that the PS4 had either below expectations or worse output on the specific Pro settings versus sometimes just the standard PS4. And I was curious about what those expectations necessarily were. I wasn't paying attention very much at that point in time because I was just really getting into PC gaming. And so I do know that the Scorpio is intended to be built to have enough power to run at 60 frames per second in 4K comfortably, which PS4 has, and Sony has noted that the PS4 admittedly does not have that ability. They can do 4K, but they can't guarantee that it's going to run smoothly at 60 FPS. And so is that extra power going to prevent Microsoft from having to deal with the same issues Sony did when they released their hardware?
I think in a lot of cases, though, like we have seen the performance from the PS4 Pro settings improve steadily, patch by patch. And Cookie can probably step in more on this. But, actually, as he just stated, it's all optimization, which makes me hesitant to imagine that games that are being released over the holiday season are truly going to be ready for a console that's not even out yet. Now, I understand that this Scorpio is being utilized in testing, and hopefully there are some developer copies. I can't think of what they're called now. I'm thinking of Press Kit. I don't know why. I do understand that there are probably Scorpio prototypes out, dev kits, thank you, Cookie, dev kits out for developers to make the Scorpio versions for until we have a better name. But technically that was happening for the PS4 Pro as well, and we didn't yield the best results. It took about half a year for things to finally settle into place for a lot of the titles that were being released at the same, being developed and released at the same time as the PS4 Pro, and even a few titles that were having PS4 Pro patches released well after the actual original release of the game. Cookie notes that Thumper came out fine, and there are some games that did not have issues upon the PS4 Pro's release. But it wasn't universal, and it was definitely something that Sony took some heat for initially. That being said, the Scorpio does seem to tote a lot of extra hardware girth, we'll say. But again, I still believe it all goes down to optimization. The Last of Us was amazing looking, and that was using the PS3. Now, Cookie also notes that there is some weird screen thing going on with Diablo 3 on PS4 Pro. So even to date, there's still some issues around that hardware. And again, it's all optimization, but that also makes me believe that there's going to be some issues with the Xbox Scorpio.
I think also as our machines get more and more powerful, we're going to have longer and longer periods of optimization before we move on to new consoles. This just wasn't a thing back in the day when we were running with Super Nintendos and just PlayStations. Like, there was optimization within those periods of time, and games got better looking and better performing, but it was for a shorter window until a new console came out, and I don't think that there was as noticeable of a difference, I guess, as well. Like, it seems that the more powerful our stuff gets, the more we can kind of continue to stretch it out for its use before we move on to using new equipment.
Let's talk about Sidebar Games. They've recently announced a new title that is slated for release on the Nintendo Switch entitled Golf Story. While we haven't seen much regarding the game, it seems to draw visual inspiration from 2D 16-bit top-down JRPGs, much like the recent farming sim Stardew Valley. And according to both its feature set and announcement trailer, Golf Story might be more story than golf. How does this make you feel, Scott?
I like golf games, so I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression that I'm going to be talking shit on golf games. But if there's a golf game that happens to focus on the story more, I think I'd really enjoy that. That would still be really fun. There's already a plethora of golf games out there. There's one called Golf with Friends that's really awesome. It's like a 3D golfer. And so if I'm playing a 2D top-down story game in which I just happen to be a golfer, if it's a good story, I don't care. I'm down with that.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever been a time where we've seen something like this before, at least within concept here. I know I've joked in the past, I'm not sure if I've done it on mic, about the NBA life simulator or basketball life simulator, so to speak, where you get to play through like college or high school, college, pro, but also involving more of like the outer life of it that I'm just interested in as a whole. But this particular story seems interesting, and as far as going to say that there are secrets and characters on all of these maps, like as to indicate that that's something that's just you would not expect from a game of this nature.
Yeah, I know. Am I befriending the guy who does the lawn, and he tells me that there's a bit of a slope like on the green on the fifth hole, that I got to shoot a little further to the right? Like, that could be really cool if you think about it.
And even the earliest golf games, we're talking arcade cabinets with the rolly ball, there's a three-dimensional aspect to it. It's not 3D actually at all, obviously, but this is completely top-down and flat. I'm really, really curious to see how the gameplay can work within this regard.
Oh yeah, because you actually can't really tell slope or anything like that.
Like maybe there's going to be like a numeral element to it, because from the maps I saw, what little bit they show, it doesn't seem very obvious.
Their maps are pretty wild too if you look at them. Like there's one where a guy's sitting on a boat and he's hitting a ball onto an island to make the shot. And then there's another one where he's like hitting over some water and a crocodile eats his ball. And he hits a ball through a fire in like this snowy like wasteland. It's really weird looking, and that could be a lot of fun.
Whereas I find that Stardew Valley comparison to be extremely fitting to it, because no one really thinks Stardew Valley is a realistic farming game or ranching game for that matter. If you want to even...
It's not.
Yeah, if you want to think of like PGA, whatever Tiger Woods is now being called, that game, because I know it's obviously not Tiger Woods anymore. If you compare that to like Farm Simulator, this is totally the Stardew Valley of golf, or at least it looks like it so far.
Yeah, and Stardew Valley ultimately ended up as a quite popular game, even though it was a shit farm simulator. The story and the characters, I think, are enough to really make fans find them endearing. So they may find that same magic balance, or may not. I mean, if their writing's not very good, or they just really can't compel an audience with the basic golf gameplay elements or the story elements, then unfortunately there's not much else that I can imagine to draw people in.
In not so related news, the PlayStation Store now has a new feature. By discovering the creators, you can get an inside look at some of the most notable personalities in PlayStation, as well as partnering companies and developers. While I initially disliked the idea of seeing a bunch of AAA execs pick out their own titles, which is very common if you pay attention to it, I've started to appreciate the fact that some of the independent developers from titles like Rogue Legacy and Nidhogg are also on their lists. But I'm still not entirely sure how cool this actually is. Have you looked into it, Scott?
Besides me knowing about it being on the list earlier, is a really cool idea. And Cookie has looked at it, so maybe he'll have some more stuff to say about it, maybe in a future episode. But what I can say is I'd love to see what other games the developer of Nidhogg has found either inspiring or just interesting and also fun to play, because these are guys who their career is based off of making something very entertaining with a much lower budget than any of these AAA options have available. And so gamification of weird concepts, if anyone's going to have a good eye to pick out other titles that may be of interest or may make a really good game, it's probably going to be people who have developed an indie game themselves. I'd totally like to look into it.
Moving on from there, let's quickly tackle out the last few topics we have in another Hotlist segment, which might become a little more official or more settled into something specific down the road. But for the time being,
I really like it as an actual piece of content for the podcast. But yeah, we're gonna start with the Nintendo stock and roll down.
Yep. Nintendo stock reaches its highest point since Wii, with Mario Odyssey and Splatoon right around the corner and potentially ARMS. Are we looking at a new starting point for Nintendo stock value, or is this going to plateau as Switch console purchases slow?
I'm not sure if Switch console purchases are slowing just yet, which is crazy to think about, because I still need to buy one too. Mario Odyssey and Splatoon are spread out just enough, and if ARMS is continuing to have a lot of interest and success after this test punch, I don't think that Nintendo's stock value is going to stick in one spot for any time soon. I think that it would fit expectation that it should be raising after this point as well. This may be a new start point for them.
And I do want to clarify, I think I fucked up, or I think I mistakenly put Mario Odyssey, switched Mario Odyssey and ARMS around, because ARMS is coming out June 16th, whereas Mario Odyssey, we don't have
it's coming out much later
yet. Yeah, so I think Splatoon 2 will definitely pick up more potential sales and growth. And then obviously ARMS as well around the corner. And then when Mario Odyssey comes up, that'll probably be at a point in time that works very well with their projected sales of other software titles.
It'll find a way to fit that gap. And I was also reading that the Splatoon 2 Bundaroo with the pink and green controllers has, I believe, sold out in Japan. So if that's any indication of how popular Splatoon 2 is going to be, it's going to be another big driving sales force for Nintendo. If I were a betting man, I'd be buying now with expectation to sell later.
There's also the announcement of Capcom's next Monster Hunter game did exceptionally well.
I'm excited for that. I haven't played a Monster Hunter game, but I understand that Monster Hunter is sort of like an open world, fight a bunch of Dark Souls bosses style of game. And so it's exactly what I want to try on the Switch.
Beat bosses, craft weapons, and armor out of their bodies. On the heels of the Bayonetta Steam release, Platinum has confirmed they are working on a new IP. While it is in early stages, we've seen some polarizing releases from Platinum, most notably Nier Automata doing fantastic. How exciting is this?
Nier Automata was great. If they release another game that's the same level of quality as Nier, I will probably be buying this, no problem. And Bayonetta was a lot of fun too. Although I don't own any of the Bayonetta games, I really enjoyed the play. And so a new IP could be really cool. Their formula works, and if they're able to use it in new and different settings, I'll still probably be interested in playing for quite a while before I get burned out.
Along with that, or that does it for the list. I did just want to point out that IO Interactive, the developers of Hitman, just went through their first round of layoffs since word broke out that their company was up for sale by parent company Square Enix. The slightly better news is that Square Enix did state this week that they're attempting to find a buyer that would be able to allow the continuation of the Hitman series, presumably meaning Season 2. Whether this means the sale or licensing of the Hitman property is not entirely clear yet, so best of luck, IO Interactive.
I hope that most of their employees are going to be able to keep their jobs, because ultimately, like, IO Interactive has made some good games. It would be a shame to see a bunch of people let go.
And I think that about does it for the podcast. For episode, we're on 17 now.
I believe so.
And to you, our listeners / viewers, if you really like looking at a static image, if you enjoyed your time with us, please review, leave a like, review us on iTunes, or excuse me, that's soon to be Apple Podcasts now, or
it is now Apple Podcasts. So if you like us, Apple Podcasts is now the place to go to give us a review, get more people to see us.
Absolutely. If you haven't already, subscribe to us on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook as well. Our email is podcast@fancyramen.com.
One last time, that's podcast@fancyramen.com. It's been a pleasure recording with you, Neil.
And to you, Scott.
And Cookie, sort of.
Yay.
Well, I'll catch you later.